Welcome to TV9 Digital, and I'm Kartikeya Sharma, and I'm joined by noted historian Vikram Sampath, who has written a two-part volume on Savarkar. Vikram, thank you so much for joining us on TV9 Digital. And let me quickly begin this interview by asking you, you have researched in detail about Savarkar's life. So if we have to sum up for the people today, the readers today, what was Savarkar's definition of Hindutva, and was it different from how we perceive Hinduism?
Thank you, Kartikeya. Great pleasure to speak to you, and thank you for inviting me to your show. I think that's a very important question, considering the ideology of Hindutva is in its political ascendancy today in India, both at the center and in several states. But the context in which Hindutva was conceptualized by Savarkar in 1923, when he was still in the Ratnagiri prison, was the Khilafat agitation that Mahatma Gandhi was running in India then, where a section of the Muslim community was being mobilized on religious grounds for the re-establishment of a caliphate in distant Turkey. So the Hindutva of Savarkar was one which defined who an Indian, and a Hindu for him was synonymous with being Hindu, with being Indian. There were no theological or religious aspects of Hinduism that Hindutva was concerned with, but somebody who considered this landmass as a sacred geography from the Indus to the seas, and who considered it both his Pitrubhu, the land of his ancestors, and also his Punyabhu, or a holy land, not in terms of religion, but in terms of his or her allegiance and devotion to this landmass. And once again, I put that in the context of the Khilafat, where extra-territorial allegiances were being sought outside India, and a community's participation in the freedom struggle of this country was being bartered in return for the support to a movement which should actually not matter to people here. Who rules Turkey, whether it was a caliph or it was Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, should not have mattered to people here. So in that context was what Savarkar originally conceptualized Hindutva, where the sacred geography of this country was very important and an allegiance to that. Now, over the years, it's been 100 years since he postulated this theory. There's been a lot of change. There have been different organizations. Savarkar was of the Hindu Mahasabha. He was never a part of the RSS, but the RSS too is an important votary of the Hindutva ideology. There were so many other organizations. There were these Boy Scouts, the Ram Sena, the Hindu Rashtra Dal, a more militant and an aggressive version of the same Hindutva. And today, of course, all these other organizations have died out. It's the RSS and, of course, the political fronts like the BJP and so on, which propagate and propound Hindutva. I think it's vastly different from what it was conceptualized, but it's also similar in some ways in the recent postulations of what even the RSS Sarsang Chalak, Dr. Mohan Bhagwat, has postulated, where he said, we're all of the same DNA, because irrespective of which religion one belongs to now, I think the ancestors were all Indians. They didn't land from, say, Jerusalem or Persia or Arabia or wherever else. So we all have the same DNA, but we have different faiths and so on. So I think that to some extent it comes back to the same concept of who belongs to this nation and so on.
His critics argue that his, as you mentioned, his idea of Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi excluded other minority communities. Now, how do you respond to it? Was it contextual, as Mohan Bhagwat said in one of his speeches in 2018, that some of the writings are contextual in context of Hindutva and not relevant today? So how do you sum up that part of Savarkar?
Yeah, I think Mohan Bhagwatji, in fact, disassociated himself even from the thoughts of Golwalkar, the bunch of thoughts, which was a little more strident, I think, than what Savarkar propounded, where there were talks of different citizenship classes and all of that for minorities. But then if you see Savarkar's, speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, they're all compiled in this, treatise called the Hindu Rashtra Darshan. So that, I think, lays clear what his policy and that of the Hindu Mahasabha itself was towards the minorities of this country. And it was not at all exclusivist, where anybody is excluded from the national, mainstream or given a second-class citizenship, as is normally alleged. So in these speeches, he time and again, mentions that they need not even be a ghost of suspicion in the minds and hearts of the minorities of this country that any of their legitimate religious, linguistic, or cultural rights would actually be infringed upon by the Hindu Rashtra. And if at all there is ever an attempt to do that, then the state would do all it could to take away these impositions. And in fact, he says that the majority community will not get any extra privileges for being a majority, and conversely, even the minority will not get any concessions just because they are less in number. Everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law, which would take precedence. And in your private space, in your house, you can practice whatever faith you want. That should not interfere in the public space or in government policy. So I think secularism in the true sense of the word. And the Hindu Mahasabha also came up with a document called the Constitution of Free Hindustan State in 1945, which has striking similarities to the final draft of the constitution, particularly on matters of secularism and so on, where it gives every citizen who has a domicile of 6 to 7 years is a citizen of India, and he or she is free to practice, profess, and preach his or her religion. And there would be no state religion in Hindustan or any of its provinces, is what this document says. So I think, when we talk about all these tags on leaders of the past, like Savarkar, one needs to go strictly by what they said in their speeches or these policy documents, which clearly made it, evident that he was trying to, of course, he was deeply suspicious of the Muslim community right from the beginning. And that was also in the context of the vivisection of the country purely on religious grounds and the separatist tendency that was prevailing then in the subcontinent, which led to the partition of the country completely. But despite that suspicion, there was this olive branch held out to them that, we can come together and work and live together in one nation. In fact, Ambedkar also mentions in his writings that with Savarkar, at least, there is a no-nonsense approach for the Muslims. They know this far and no further. We have clarity of thought and purpose as to how do you deal with this issue. Whereas with the Congress, it is so muddled and it is anything other than, treachery to the country and to the Muslim community and so on, is what Dr. Ambedkar also mentions. So I think it's very important to see the context in which these statements and policy, documents were put out.
Will it be correct to say that Savarkar sowed the seeds of cultural nationalism or Hindu nationalism, which was different from the idea of civic nationalism, which many other countries follow?
Very true, very true. I think, so again, Hindutva for him, right in his treatise, I mentioned that, in the very beginning, he says Hindutva has nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism. What happens to the soul, the afterlife, all of that is left to all the saints and samas and different sects and subsects within the faith to discuss, with. For him, Hinduism was in fact a subsect, almost a subset of the larger umbrella of Hindutva, where it was more of a cultural and a national identity marker, so to say, where he said territorial nationalism is not only what would work, but then it is cultural nationalism. It's also your association with, as I mentioned earlier, the sacred geography, which is what would lead to true emotional integration of communities to weld together in the form of a nation, particularly in a country like India, which is so, multilingual, multi-religious, multiracial, and so on. So, and Hindutva was more of a political answer to a political Islam, which was, as I mentioned earlier, getting more aggressive.
Vikram, is this the reason why when the senior leadership of RSS and BJP talk about Ram Temple, it is less in religious term and more in context of a national project, a national heritage, a place where a nation can unite, monument for part of a national endeavor. Is there a connecting line?
Perfectly. I think that's the whole idea, where and very interestingly, many of the people, I mean, Savarkar or even Mr. Advani, who led the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, they were not very vociferous practicing Hindus, so to say, in the ritualistic sense of the word. So was probably Jinnah. He was not even a very, a 5-time praying Muslim. He used to drink and all of that. So I think the religious aspect, the ritualistic aspect of religion was much less important to many leaders, and hence it becomes more of a, as you rightly pointed out, a national project than a religious one, which is based on ritual. Savarkar himself was anti-ritual. He was completely against the concept of a caste-based society. He did not want a Shraddh ceremony performed for himself or his wife. So someone who was very progressive in his views that way, but then still a votary of the Hindu community at the time when the community had no one to speak for it.
Vikram, generally when we perceive of leaders who have influence on history, we think that they never change their position and views. Like Gandhi changed his position multiple point of time on very important issues, from Dalit politics to freedom, and how one engages with the British. Even Ambedkar did it over a period of time. So in the case of Savarkar, if you can shed light, for example, he rallied against the use of cow as a sacred symbol for Hindus, but yet he wanted to put the image of cow on the Hindu Mahasabha's flag. Can you just take us through those parts of Savarkar's life where he himself changed goalposts, created new and left the old ones?
Yeah, I think that's also an interesting aspect of his life, where particularly his attitude towards maybe the Muslims, which I think was an evolving project through his life. As a child, he was in a Maharashtra, which was a communal tinderbox right through the 1880s and 1890s. There were so many, communal riots that rocked Maharashtra on the issue of cow slaughter, on the issue of procession in front of mosques, and this is what is noted even in the colonial documents of the time. And leaders of the time, none less than Bal Gangadhar Tilak himself, vociferously protested against the government's what he called as appeasement of the Muslim community. And a young Savarkar also, who was seeing all this, reading the case, he was imbibing these these concepts, the social concepts of the time. And so you have that famous anecdote of how he and his friends go in and actually kind of vandalize a mosque which was in disuse. It was not a mosque that was in use, and it was this whole us versus them kind of seeds that was sown in the Maharashtra of the late 19th century. But then the same Savarkar in London, when he was a student there, and he also researched extensively on the 1857 uprising, which he called for the first time the first war of Indian independence. In that, he says Hindus and Muslims came together, and they're like different colors of a rainbow. He gives equal importance to all the Muslim leaders of the 1857 uprising, including Bahadur Shah Zafar and so on. But then the same Savarkar also changes in cellular jail, where the experience there of how the Muslim Jamadars were using torture as a means to ensure a lot of Hindu prisoners could be converted to Islam forcibly. And of course, the Khilafat movement, which, as I mentioned earlier, changed him completely to give this intellectual response to Gandhi. And from then on, there was no looking back, I think. While the suspicion was there, as I mentioned, there was also, as he was progressing closer to independence, he realized that there is no other option but to live together if you oppose partition. And the Hindu Mahasabha was the only political party, which tooth and nail opposed partition till the very end. So if you oppose the partition, then how do you live with people who are demanding a partition? You give them some concessions, you give them, you have a conciliatory approach as to how can you live together despite all these differences that are civilizational and that all of them accounted for. So I think this was the trajectory, one of the trajectories of the evolution of his thoughts, right from a young boy till the time of India's partition, particularly on this very, very vexed issue of Hindu-Muslim relationships and so on which he's beaten up quite often.
Vikram, before I move on to other subjects, in your opinion, how much of this Sangha Hindutva ideology and the present dispensation today would you say is influenced or defined by Savarkar's vision?
It's so difficult to say that, because I think it's all contextual. I mean, as Dr. Bhagwat mentioned, many of the thoughts and views and opinions of these leaders were relevant at that time. And I think Hindutva as a social, political, cultural philosophy also evolves according to the needs of the time. So we can't really, I mean, while the overall overarching idea may be similar to what it was during its conception, I think these all political ideologies and philosophies try to evolve and adapt themselves to the circumstances. I'll give just one instance. I think recently one of the RSS ideologues, Sunil Lambekarji, he wrote a book on RSS of the 21st century and what its vision was for India. And among various other things, it also mentioned that the RSS would look at looking at same-sex marriages, things like how there is inheritance, property rights, and all of that for same-sex couples. Now, this could be something that could never have been imagined in the 1920s, and that too of a so-called ultra-right-wing orthodox party. But then, if there is a demand for that in society, then an ideology adapts to that, and it changes and evolves. So it's very difficult to pinpoint and say exactly what Savarkar or a Golwalkar spoke about at that time. Many of that may not even be relevant today. There may be other issues that could have taken over, which become relevant, and an ideology needs to respond to that if it doesn't have to be ossified as a fossil. So while the core remains, I think, drawn from these ideals, a lot of it, I think, is a work in progress kind of a ideology.
There are two very important aspects in your book. One is about the violence you have addressed in context of after Gandhi's assassination, and the second is the concept of Savarkar's legacy as being contentious. So first, I would like you to answer this question: why do you say that he's a maligned patriot, and you have a chapter is there where you say it's a contentious legacy. Can you just take us through that? Why did you use the word contentious legacy and a maligned patriot?
Yeah. I think that's there for all your viewers to know that almost all the time Savarkar intrudes modern contemporary political discourse like very few leaders of the past do. He forms part of election manifestos. The BJP promised a Bharat Ratna for him in the Maharashtra elections. Rahul Gandhi all the time takes jibes at him. The Rajasthan government decides whether to drop the Veer from his name. The Chhattisgarh chief minister has an opinion about him. So all the time, a man who died way back in 1966, he forms part of political discourse today, where accusations, counter accusations, all of that keep hurling across the board, and including the Congress or the opposition parties think that the best way to get to the BJP is by maligning their ideological ancestor, so to say, and saying he was a apologist to the British, he was a stooge, he gave himself the term Veer, he wrote his own autobiography in a pseudonym Chitragupta, all of which are false and which I have actually refuted with proof and with sources in both my volumes. But then his legacy continues to be contested, continues to be contentious. In addition, one of course is because of all of this. I mean, the constant allegation, even on social media, if you see, it's all about did he sell out to the British? Did he become a traitor? Which again, I refute, and we can talk about that if need be. But then also his alleged involvement in Gandhi's assassination, of which he was actually acquitted by the court in 1949, Justice Atmacharan in the Red Fort trials. But then the long shadow of Gandhi's assassination continues to haunt him even after an acquittal. The Kapoor Commission implicated him in a way without any corroborative evidence, including all the people who supposedly gave evidences against him, including his secretary Gajanan Damle, his bodyguard Appa Kasar. They were not even invited by the commission to depose in front of them in the 101 witnesses that the Kapoor Commission actually examined. And more recently, as recent as 2018, you had the Supreme Court of India, on the basis of a public interest litigation, come out and say that there is no case for Savarkar's involvement in Gandhi's murder, and the Kapoor Commission, cannot overturn a trial court's verdict. So I think the highest court of the country also giving a kind of a conclusive, decision on this vexed topic. I think that should set this to rest, but then it doesn't. And Sardar Patel had said this to Shama Prasad Mukherjee in a letter when he had asked him, please treat my leader a little more generously. He sacrificed a lot for the country. He said, yeah, we will not do anything on political considerations, but legally he may be exonerated, but the moral albatross will stay on him.
Yes,
and
that's the word you
exactly
use in
what
the
has
book, moral
happened.
albatross.
Yeah, making him contentious even today.
But you also go through episodes of violence. Is it correct to say that it was pogrom? The post Gandhi's assassination, the violence which took place, because
Yes.
pogrom is a very specific activity targeted against a community. So
Yeah.
you are not calling it riots.
No.
The word is used as pogrom. Why?
Yes, because this is again, Kartikeya, I think an episode from our history which has been wantonly, covered up by the powers that be after independence. Just because Godse and Narayan Apte and others were of the Maharashtrian Brahmin community, specifically Brahmins in Maharashtra were targeted after Gandhi's murder. And initially, anybody with the surname Godse, they were actually pulled out of their homes and burnt alive, their properties desecrated. And then the antipathy spread to all the Chitpavan Brahmins, the same community that all of these people belong to, and then even the Deshasthas and other Brahmins of Maharashtra. And, I quote sources, there are only scholars outside India who have done research on this, unfortunately, in these 70 years. Maureen Patterson and also Coenraad Elst, who have spoken about this in the past. And Maureen Patterson came to India in the 1950s to research this. And she says that she was not even given access to documents by the Maharashtra government then and the Maharashtra police. So this was a complete, whitewash and cover up of this incident. But then from Bombay, Pune, Nagpur to also the, the Deccan region, Satara, Belgaum, the Kolhapur, Meerut, Sangli, Patwardhan states, all of those places, Brahmins were systematically, identified and hacked. People used to be pulled out of buses and trains, identified by their caste and killed. Properties would be burnt. And Maureen mentions that while the exact number of people killed could be over several thousands, the exact number cannot be ascertained because no FIRs were filed, no cases were registered. Even the property losses, she estimates anything from 6 to 10 crores, a huge amount at
Are you
those
saying
times.
members of a
And that
political
too-
party were part of it?
Yes. And in fact, it was the Congress itself which led many of the mobs. And I mentioned this on the basis of actually, the words of a congressman himself, a very senior congressman, Dwarka Prasad Mishra, who was a Congress, home minister in the central provinces. And he says this, and I quote him: although hardly half a dozen Maharashtrian Brahmins were involved in Godse's crime, a very large number of them had to pay a price for it. Those who indulged in these unlawful activities included a large number of congressmen belonging to non-Brahmin communities. In fact, in Nagpur and Berar, the troublemakers were mostly congressmen, some even being office bearers of various Congress committees. Among those arrested by the police, there were more than 100 congressmen, and I was immediately subjected to immense pressure for their release. In a meeting of prominent congressmen of Nagpur, I had to face severe criticism when they threatened to take their complaint to Home Minister Sardar Patel that I had to tell them to bring a directive for me from Delhi, unquote. So this was Dwarka Prasad Mishra, a senior Home Minister of the Central Provinces, talking about Congress involvement in this pogrom and how it was hushed up over these decades. And I wish we had not done that. We would have, it was like a trailer to the terrible anti-Sikh riots that rocked India in 1984. So where after a political assassination, members of the community of that assassin sadly end up paying a price for this. In Savarkar's own case, I mean, a mob of 1,000 people attacked his house in Dadar immediately after that. His younger brother Narayan Rao, who had nothing to do with anything of all of this. He was a practicing doctor. He was pulled out of his house and stoned so badly that he was lying in a pool of blood. And almost 1 year later, he never recovered from that injury, and he died of a brain hemorrhage. Year later. So these are all very, very uncomfortable truths of our past, which have sadly been whitewashed in a way that the people of this country will never get to know.
Two quick questions. One is that both Ambedkar and Savarkar had very different views and opinions from Gandhi. Doesn't it surprise you as a historian that Ambedkar gets away in terms of that scrutiny, but Savarkar gets a stick in terms of his differences with Gandhi on or the Congress party on various issues? Why did that happen? And the second question is, that would be my last, both of them, who profoundly impact the Indian politics today, they electorally failed after the independence. Why did that happen?
Yeah. So for your first question, I mean, Ambedkar, I think has been, once you appropriate characters of the past and also make them, they enter into the vote bank politics, then a lot of objective assessment of them becomes very difficult. You start eulogizing them, and anyone who goes against them, it is considered blasphemous. You're an iconoclast. So Gandhi, to a large extent, has almost been made a superhuman. Likewise, Ambedkar, you really can't do an objective assessment of him. I mean, in the book also I quote a lot of Baba Saheb's, writings, which were a lot more virulent against Islam, against Muslims. He advocated a complete, transfer of populations between the two countries, whether India and Pakistan, and said these are two very, very civilizationally opposite and diametrically opposite kind of, communities. But today, Ambedkar would also his portrait would form part of the anti-CAA protests, whereas he would have been probably the first person who would have, agreed to a law like this, which helped religious minorities from the neighboring countries to take shelter in India. So it's very sad that we do not analyze, characters like this, whereas Savarkar is that way a political orphan. Nobody would appropriate his legacy as much. Even the ruling dispensation, the BJP, only picks and chooses what they would probably want from his legacy, from his writings. And so he's not as appropriated as an Ambedkar is. And so it is very easy to castigate him all the time. Ambedkar also never participated in the freedom struggle that way. He never went to jail. In 1942, when the Quit India movement was raging the country, he actually called it as a treachery against the nation and urged all Indians not to participate in it. He was a member of the Viceroy's Council then. But then nobody would call him a stooge of the British or somebody who was a collaborator.
Absolutely.
But for Savarkar, it is easy to put all these epithets because there is nobody defending his case, and you're not going to lose votes if you probably gain more if you have epithets hurled against him. But your second question, sorry.
Yes, absolutely, because that's the most, I would say, ironical part, that these are the two figures which dominate the 80% of the spectrum of the politics today, even more than Gandhi, both Ambedkar and Savarkar, but they were failures during their own lifetime.
True. And yeah, I think Savarkar, that way I've also mentioned in the book as well, that as a political leader, I don't think he had that sagacity to carry his party only, along with him. There was so much of dissension within the Hindu Mahasabha. You had his faction versus that of of Shama Prasad Mukherjee, and constantly this Maharashtra versus Bengal tussle that was going on. And so he could not even carry his party along. And the Hindu Mahasabha, though in the initial period of his presidentship, became a fighting fit political party electorally to take on both the Congress as well as the Muslim League. By the time of the 1946 elections, it was completely wiped out because, he could not convince people of his policy and agenda. And likewise with Ambedkar, post-independence, despite his important role in the drafting of the constitution and so on, electorally, he got marginalized and thereby politically too just dwindled away. So it's very sad that, thinkers, ideologues like this, who had so many contributions in the electoral arena, I think they fared so badly.
Thank you so much, Vikram, for joining me on this special show, and a marvelous book, the concluding book which you have written on Savarkar, a much contested figure in contemporary politics. Thank you so much for making time for our program. And for other news and development, keep on watching TV9 Digital.